videos are off. So we're joined today by two of our friends who are engaging in advocacy efforts that are really critical and impact gender justice throughout our community. The first friend and partner that we have today is Sam Petto. He's the communications director with the ACLU. And he's here today to talk about their efforts around people, not prisons, specifically ACLU's efforts to stop the new prison plan. And then we're also joined by Weston Miller, who's the Director of Public Policy with Civic Nebraska. And he's going to discuss some voter rights and issues with us later today. So with that, they are by far the experts in these areas. So I'll turn it over to the two of them. Thank you both for being here and for sharing your expertise and all your advocacy for our community. So Sam, if you want to get started.
Oh, well, thanks for having me on. It's really exciting to be part of this and great to hear that people are taking time out of their day to help figure out how they can contribute toward Nebraska that better represents and takes care of all of us. It's exciting also that we're part of the What's New section of this, because really you couldn't have picked a better day to talk about this topic. About 2 hours ago, the governor joined with Senator Lathrop and the Chief Justice of the Nebraska Supreme Court to discuss getting smart on justice. And that was a surprise and also a welcome surprise that's signaling that we are going to be working with an outside organization called the Crime and Justice Institute to start to take a really concerted 3-branch effort at looking at the things that are fueling our current challenges in the criminal legal system. Unfortunately, there's always an unfortunately, right, is that the governor believes that no matter what, we'll need to construct a $230 million prison. And what we and Nebraskans know is that there is a better way and a better option for Nebraska, and that is getting smart on justice. So yesterday, we joined with a lot of other great organizations in urging the Appropriations Committee to not advance funding, to not approve funding for a new prison. This would be possibly the largest expense at taxpayer dollars ever toward a project or complex. That was reported in the World Herald this morning. And we see it as an investment in what has not worked and what too often, unfortunately, compounds harm and contributes to lasting negative effects for our communities. And we know from looking at our sister states that there are better options before us, and that involves getting smart on justice. Thanks to the Women's Fund for posting our Stop the New Prison page. That's how you should get involved at aclunebraska.org/prison, or just go to our homepage. And what we are urging senators to do is to use this opportunity to work with this outside organization and to work with each other and community stakeholders to chart a better path forward. That means increasing use of diversion. It means strengthening reentry programs, and it means investing in our communities so that mental health services are there for people, so that people are being met with a public health response when they have public health challenges instead of a criminal response. That is good for Nebraskans. It's also good for our limited resources. It costs about $3,000 a year to supervise someone who's going through a problem-solving court, like a drug court or a mental health court. It costs $40,000 a year to house someone in prison. So you see how those numbers escalate quickly. So at the ACLU, we're excited to be working with a variety of partners to make sure that we are communicating with senators that we don't want a new prison. We want a smart justice approach, and that means diversion, reentry, and meeting community needs and community investments. So this is an opportunity. You'll hear a lot of things in media coverage coming out of this and in conversations to come. I believe it was LB 605, a legislative effort from just a few years ago to start to get smart on criminal justice, to take some of those necessary steps in terms of addressing sentences that were tying judges' hands, to making sure that reentry support was there and that we were really getting serious on diversion efforts. But that was just that first initial step, and we didn't go all the way or follow through on all of them. So this new effort that Governor Ricketts announced with Senator Lathrop really does represent a real opportunity to start to take those steps and move to a place where we need to be. I'd say it's all the more exciting from some polling we did that showed just really this is not a political issue. Across the political spectrum, people are concerned about outcomes, and they recognize that there is a better way than warehousing people for any number of years and then letting them out. What we want to do to advance our shared public safety goals and our shared public health goals is to make sure that we're meeting public health challenges with a public health response and not criminalizing behavior and taxing ourselves to death to meet those challenges. So that's a broad overview of the challenge, what we're talking about, newer elements to it. If someone's really interested in this topic, the very best thing that they can do is get in touch with their own state senator and then each member of the Nebraska Legislature's Appropriations Committee. So they've already heard testimony on this topic. Again, if you go to that link that's been provided in the chat, you'll be able to see a quick link to the Appropriations Committee. But they have already heard testimony. So from there, they're going to digest that. They're going to look at what the Economic Forecasting Board is projecting in terms of what our revenue looks like, what our challenges look like from a fiscal perspective. And then they're going to decide if they want to green light what would be, again, possibly the state's largest taxpayer expenditure on a project ever to build a new prison, or if they want to push pause and see if we can get smart on justice and to pick a different approach that focuses more on making sure we are not incarcerating people who do not need to be incarcerated. And also that for folks who are incarcerated, the focus is on what we expect them to do, which is rehabilitation and making sure that our friends, family, and neighbors who are behind bars are successful when they come back and enter our communities instead of a punitive approach. So those are actions that you can do and the state of play on prison. Last thing I'd recommend, or just to tie this all together, is you'll hear also a lot of talk about getting smart on justice. I encourage you to check out the link on our homepage and then also to research the ACLU Smart Justice Approach, which outlines some of the challenges that we currently have, not just in Nebraska, but across the nation, and how we can do better. And I want to recognize my privilege and position as a white person talking about this, but one thing we really need to reckon with is the racial injustice across the criminal justice system. And right now, Nebraskans of color are far overrepresented in our prison numbers, in our county jails, and non-surprisingly also in police practices, which we outlined in our report called Equality Before the Stop. So this isn't just about public health, community health, and needs, but it really is also about naming and, more importantly, addressing and owning the impact of institutional racism across our community and making sure that we are making changes to our policy, to our practices, to own that and to address it and to undo that harm. And it's a multifaceted problem, so it's going to be a multifaceted solution. But the most important thing is that people who are on this call who are passionate about that would really encourage them to use their voices. This is a critical juncture coming up ahead of the Appropriation Committee's decision in March. We feel like we have a lot of momentum with us. So get smart on the issues, reach out to your senator, reach out to each state senator on the Appropriations Committee, and let them know that you prefer and that Nebraska needs a smart justice approach for meeting this problem, not a new prison. So that I don't want to intrude too much on Weston's time. I think it's coming up toward my own time. So that's the quick and dirty of it. If there's anything I left out, I'd be happy to illuminate that now, or you can also get in touch with us. Our contact information is on our website.
Thank you so much for that, Sam. For everyone following, we've added some links in the chat, both to ACLU's Stop the New Prison Plan link, as well as a link to find your own senator. So with that, if anyone has any questions before Sam has to hop off, if you could throw those in the chat in the Q&A function. We'll give just a couple of minutes for any that are coming in before we turn it over to Weston.
Sounds good. I'll use my space as we wait for questions just to lift up a lot of great partners. Of course, the Women's Fund, but also others engaged in this include RISE, Black and Pink, Nebraska Appleseed testified yesterday as well. And so there is a large, awesome, both local grassroots movement and then a lot of organizations that are speaking out now because we know it's about the resources that we have available to us and the path we want to choose for justice in our community.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing any come in through the chat, but Sam, if anyone wants to connect with the ACLU, is the best way to do that to, and on this issue specifically, can they go to that link that we've provided in the chat? Is that the best way? How do you recommend people connect with you directly?
So that's where to get smart on the issues is aclunebraska.org or aclunebraska.org/prison. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter and reach out to us there. We do look at and respond to our direct messages, so that's a great option. And finally, if you just go up on our website to the staff page, you'll find my information there. And I am always happy to connect people with resources, to help answer questions, and to make sure that we are leveraging our collective power as from a position of strength and as best we can.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me on.
Of course. All right, Weston, do you want to take it over?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you all so much for having me. I'm Weston Miller. I'm the Director of Public Policy at Civic Nebraska. A 30-second overview if you're not familiar with our organization. Civic Nebraska is a nonpartisan nonprofit. Our mission statement is that we're committed to creating a more modern and robust democracy for all Nebraskans. That takes a lot of different forms for us, some of which, or most of which, are not political at all. The bulk of our work is actually in after-school programs focused on youth civic leadership. We have some initiatives focused on civic health more broadly throughout the state, but then we have initiatives related to election policy and voting rights. As our Director of Public Policy, my main focus of work is with the legislature, specifically now on the voting rights elections piece. I appreciate having some time. This is also very timely. We had a very large hearing on Wednesday related to some pretty high profile elections and voting rights issues. And we've got another one coming up next Wednesday. So I'll kind of give you the brief on how things are going so far. Almost every elections and voting rights issue in the legislature goes to the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee. So I spend most of my time with those 8 lovely people. And let me just kind of give you the overview of some of the big conversations they've been having and how you could get involved. So last Wednesday, 2 days ago, there was a very long day where in the morning we talked about the winner take all proposal for Nebraska's Electoral College. In the afternoon, we talked about voter ID, which is kind of Civic Nebraska's most high profile issue that we work on. Those are both initiatives that we opposed. So I'll really quickly kind of give you the overview on maybe both sides of the argument, because I don't have a monopoly on truth. So you're welcome to disagree with me, that's fine. And then we'll talk about why Civic Nebraska quickly opposes those issues. So I'll start with voter ID because that's kind of the flagship issue. There's been a voter ID proposal every biennium in Nebraska for the last decade. And Civic Nebraska has always kind of been at the forefront with great partners like the ACLU to keep that proposal from becoming law. Supporters of voter ID say that we need to show some kind of photo identification on election day to combat this kind of boogeyman of voter fraud that exists. The conversation has evolved in the last couple of years because proponents say, oh my gosh, there's this fraud, we got to show IDs to stop it. And folks like me say, oh, there's voter fraud, interesting, can you prove that? And recently they've realized, no, we can't. So they're kind of pivoting to say, well, now there's fear of voter fraud. Voters are afraid. There is a lack of confidence in the institution of elections. This is a thing we can do to kind of shore up confidence. I'm extremely interested in that conversation. Confidence in institutions is very important to me, very important to Civic Nebraska. I want Nebraskans to have faith in their institutions, including and especially in the voting process. One of the questions that we're trying to ask, though, because it's of course never as quite as simple as it seems, is why is there a fear of voter fraud? Why is there a problem right now with our confidence in the election system? I would offer that people are afraid of voter fraud because our politicians are making us afraid of voter fraud. And kind of a crass but accurate example is that if I call your house in the middle of the night and I say, oh my gosh, neighbor, someone's breaking into your house, you're going to feel fear about that experience. And that fear is going to be very real. And you're going to want to take actions to resolve that fear. It also has nothing to do with what's actually happening. No one's actually breaking into your house, but I've called you and I've told you, so it's frightening and it's scary. People who have the platforms of a state senator or a US senator or a president have a tremendous amount of ability to conjure up that fear in the electorate. And that's kind of resulted in some of these policy conversations. There are 5 questions that Civic Nebraska encourages our senators to ask about every single policy. I think this is very relevant to the prison conversation. And they're questions that we've taken from the senators themselves. These are questions that our legislators usually ask, but when something is a little more political, we kind of exempt certain conversations. So really quickly, those questions are, number one, is there an actual problem to solve? It's a good place to start. Number two, and this is our hang up with voter ID, is your policy actually going to solve the problem that you've proposed? There's not actually any evidence that exists that voter ID stops voter fraud. This is the main point I tried to make on Wednesday, because it's kind of easy to just assume, oh, if we show IDs, fraud will stop. One of the senators used the metaphor of radar and catching speeders. Like, how do we know people are speeding if we don't have radar set up in the first place? Which is interesting, but also we can look to the 35 other states, 35, 36 other states that have had voter ID systems in place for years, which should be producing tons of evidence that, oh my gosh, look, there's this fraud and we've stopped it with this cool new policy. But that evidence doesn't exist. There's been voter ID laws in place since, I believe, 2005 is when Indiana adopted theirs. And there is simply no evidence to suggest that voter ID laws either stop voter fraud or even make people feel better about voter fraud. Again, I would argue that's because the fear is coming from the politicians themselves. We are very fortunate in Nebraska to have a robust coalition of both advocates and senators who know that voter ID is not as simple as it sounds, and they understand the adverse consequences it could have on voters of color, on rural voters, on older voters, and they understand it's just an unnecessary hindrance in general. If you want to take action on this issue, I think the best thing we can do right now is to provide some positive support for those senators who are standing strong against this issue. The government committee is 8 members, which means they need to get 5 yeses to get this onto the floor. We have some stalwart opponents of voter ID on the committee, and I'm very thankful for them, and I want to give them a shout out. So Senator Blood, Senator Hunt, Senator Matt Hansen, and Senator McCollister have all been unwavering in their opposition to voter ID. But I can also tell you for sure, they get a lot of flack for doing that. They get a lot of phone calls from constituents saying, why don't you support this issue? This should be so common sense. I would like to fill their inboxes and their voicemails with some positive reinforcement to thank them for taking this position, for taking this brave position, because voter ID laws are very popular, but that doesn't mean that they're good policy. So if you want to reach out to those senators, thank them for their support and encourage them to stay unwavering in that opposition, I think that would go a long way. The second part of our long Wednesday was the winner-take-all system, our electoral college. I'll try to give the quick summary here. So Nebraska and Maine are the 2 states that have an unusual way for electing their president electing the president in terms of how we allocate our electoral votes. Every other state just says whoever gets the most votes, they get all of the electoral votes from our state. Nebraska and Maine split it up by congressional district. Senator Slama wants to take us back to a winner-take-all system to be more in line with every other state. Her basic argument was twofold. One is that I think it's good to be uniform, and we just want our state to kind of just vote as a whole. It's interesting to me. Her second reason, though, was that our current system is really prone to gerrymandering, which was a fascinating argument and is very, very true. So she wants to take us back to a winner-take-all system because if we allocate our electoral votes by congressional district, now there's an incentive for partisan gerrymandering to make sure that, in this case, CD2 does or doesn't become a blue or a red dot. Very compelled by that second argument, I would simply offer that the problem to fix in that situation is the partisan gerrymandering, not our actual system itself. It's also a problem that our legislature can fix this year. Senator McCollister has a bill, LB 107, that would provide some really basic, important rules for the redistricting process. Senator Slama herself is on the executive committee, which could vote this out to the floor. And that's the way that we fix the problem. In general, Civic Nebraska opposes the winner-take-all system because we oppose the Electoral College as a whole. We stake out the radical position that the person who wins the most votes should win the election. That's what we think should happen. And the Electoral College is a very old kind of fundamental part of our Constitution. I understand. That's why we're able to amend our Constitution. Just because an idea is old does not mean an idea is good. The Electoral College is by definition a system to give certain states more weight than other states. And we'd like to make this as simple as possible. The notion of one person, one vote is kind of lost on the Electoral College. We start to substitute that for one state, one vote, which kind of became a part of the hearing on Wednesday. Now, obviously, the Nebraska legislature cannot abolish the Electoral College, but what we can do is keep our current system, which is at least a little bit more representative than going back to a winner-take-all system. The last thing I want to touch on is a hearing that's coming up next Wednesday. So we have 2 bills that are about felony disenfranchisement. This is an issue I care a lot about, and it hasn't been in the headlines because this is more of a momentum continuing conversation this year. It's not legislation that's getting a lot of attention, but I think it should. So Nebraska has one of the most restrictive systems in the country when it comes to voting rights for people who are currently or have formerly served a felony sentence. Our system says that once you're convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote immediately. That's fairly standard in most states. You can't vote while you're in prison. You can't vote while you're on probation, parole. Once you're completely off paper, then Nebraska has this ridiculous extra 2 years where you still can't vote, and then you can re-register. Senator Justin Wayne has introduced LB 158, which would simply eliminate that 2-year waiting period. This bill was introduced in 2017. It passed, it was vetoed, and we weren't able to override the veto. This is an incredibly common sense, moderate proposal. If you've served your time, you should get to vote. It shouldn't be complicated. This is just an extra punishment that we tack on. This is relevant and important for a number of reasons, but any conversation surrounding racial injustice in our carceral system now applies to this if we're also restricting voting rights based on your criminal status. So those injustices begin to seep into our voting system. Senator Michaela Cavanaugh has introduced LR 10CA, which would just do away with the entire notion of felony disenfranchisement. This is a more progressive position. It's not as, there are 2 states, Maine and Vermont, that have no felony disenfranchisement at all. I'm happy to report they have not devolved into Gotham City. They're doing just fine because your criminal status has no logical connection to your voting rights. My position on this is that I encourage all of our senators to just treat all constitutional rights the same. There's been a lot of really intense discussion in the last couple of years about First Amendment rights, Second Amendment rights. And when we talk about any right other than voting, a large bipartisan group of senators have a lot of tough questions, like why does the state really need to infringe on this right in the first place? I think that's a great, valid question. I think the state has the burden to prove why we need to infringe on your right. And I would just like to see that same level of scrutiny applied to voting rights. This is an issue that is very personal to me. It affects a number of members of my family. I think one of the biggest ways you can get involved in this issue is to help us demystify this notion of who is affected by a felony conviction in the first place. I am extremely confident that every single person on this call, by at least 1 degree of separation, has someone you know or care about who has been affected by a felony conviction. We just have this mythical kind of misbelief that, oh, that's a thing that happens to other people. And that's just almost certainly not the case. These are proposals that are also before the government committee. And in this case, I would encourage you to call every member of the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee. And if you are at all personally affected by this issue, if you have a family member, someone you care about, just let them know, because this is an issue that there's almost no public opposition actually to this proposal. It's just a lot of, I would say, either quiet opposition or apathy. I'm like, oh, this isn't that big of a deal. Like, I don't know anybody who's affected by this. And we just need to demonstrate that this is actually a huge deal that affects a lot of people. I'm going to stop there because there are like 25 elections bills this year, but those are the 3 that I was most interested in kind of sharing about. I would love to answer any questions. I'll be here for the whole thing. So if folks have questions or comments, I would love to chat about it. I will plug really quickly in terms of digitally getting involved. 2 websites I might point you to. civicnebraska.org is just our homepage where you can get involved in any component of Civic Nebraska's programming. We have a new page, civicnebraska.vote, that is focused specifically on these elections and voting rights issues. You can go there for a policy brief. You can go there to request an early ballot. You can go there to update your voter registration. So if you want to get involved, that's a good place to start.
Thank you so much, Weston, and thank you for uplifting ways that people can get involved. We've shared a couple of those links in the chat. You mentioned the government committee, so we have a link in the chat to the government committee, and we're adding in those links that you just referenced now to the chat. So again, if anyone has any questions, please add those to the chat or the Q&A function. We'll continue monitoring those. And Weston, as long as you're able to stay on, we'll circle back to you with those questions. And I know Tiffany just arrived. So Tiffany, if you want to take it over.
Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. So thank you so much to Sam and Weston for sharing and lifting up some really important and highly relevant issues to gender justice and the things that we care about as supporters of the Women's Fund. Kelsey and I are going to go through what's next and what's needed for many of the bills in which the Women's Fund is taking a leadership role. And so today we have in Health and Human Services Committee this afternoon, the Sexual Assault Emergency Care Act. This is introduced by Senator Megan Hunt. And this is the bill, I think we've talked about it previously, and it's been introduced before. It will require information to be provided about emergency contraception in the hospital when sexual assault survivors show up and report sexual assault. It will not only require information to be provided, but also it will also require offering of EC, so having EC stocked if that is the choice of the patient to access that pregnancy prevention. We next week we have LB 360 is in Judiciary Committee, and Kelsey's going to chat through some of these judiciary bills coming up.
Sure. So as Tiffany said, next week we have LB 360. This hearing is in the Judiciary Committee on the 24th. And this is a bill brought by Senator Pansing Brooks to address some of the definitions in our statute that pertain to sexual assault and consent. So sometimes this bill has been called an affirmative consent bill, and it really clarifies some definitions around coercion, force, and threat under sexual assault definitions to better recognize trauma and how trauma presents in someone experiencing sexual violence. So it establishes that force, physical force, does not need to be present for consent to have been violated. It also establishes, it adds very specific language to affirm that a victim can withdraw consent after having previously given consent, that they are always able to withdraw consent, and someone violating that would still be in violation and still committing sexual assault. And then it adds in some explicit language defining that victims can resist both actively and passively. It adds in some language about what without consent means to include sexual contact with consent was not knowingly or voluntarily or freely given, that would still be a violation of consent. And so these kind of alterations to the definitions we see as really important to better recognizing and reflecting an understanding of trauma and how trauma presents in our laws. We know that common responses, particularly to sexual violence, can present both in fight or flight reactions, and also in freeze reactions where someone may shut down, someone may not be, actively resisting in more active forms, but nonetheless not consenting. And so our laws currently don't really fully recognize that freeze reaction to trauma. And so this bill would better address that and better support survivors of sexual violence. So again, that hearing is next Wednesday in the Judiciary Committee. And if you have any questions on that, please continue to add those to the chat. On Friday, and sorry, I think that I said the 26th, Wednesday is the 24th, in case I got that wrong. Friday is the 26th in Judiciary, and there are a whole host of bills that day that are really critical to LGBTQ non-discrimination. So the first one that we want to uplift is LB 517, brought by Senator Hunt. So this bill would would provide for a gender neutral designation on license plates and also amend some processes around amending someone's gender or sex classification on their birth certificate. So specifically for ID, somebody would be able to designate on their ID a gender neutral designation. So where it currently says M for male and F for female, there would be an additional designation of X for anyone that falls outside of the gender binary, or anyone not wishing to designate their gender through a male or female designation on their license. It also explicitly states that no documentation would be required in demonstrating someone's gender designation. And then the last piece of this is for the birth certificate. Currently, only those who have undergone sex confirmation surgery are eligible to have their sex assignment changed on their birth certificate. So this bill would expand that eligibility of who can pursue having their sex assigned at birth designation on their birth certificate, and amend that so that it's reflective of their gender identity, and provide more avenues for that process. Then the next bill, also on next Friday in Judiciary, is LB 120. So this is an LGBTQ employment non-discrimination. It explicitly includes gender identity and sexual orientation into current employment non-discrimination laws. And so this bill is really reaffirming a Supreme Court ruling from last year and really strengthening those protections within our statute and within our laws explicitly. The next one is LB 231. So, the next one is LB 230, which would prohibit LGBTQ discrimination within our housing laws. So this explicitly pertains to both sexual orientation and gender identity, being included in non-discrimination laws as they pertain to public places. So for example, in restaurants or hotels or movie theaters, as well as within our housing codes, when someone's buying a home or renting an apartment, that those designations would, that both gender identity and sexual orientation would be explicitly included and protected in our non-discrimination laws. And then lastly, the bill on Friday that we want to uplift now is LB 231, and this would prohibit conversion therapy. So conversion therapy is a practice that attempts to change somebody's sexual orientation or gender identity. It is not only a very discriminatory process, but also a very traumatic practice that we believe has no place in our state. And so this bill would prohibit healthcare providers from practicing conversion therapy. And any healthcare provider who did practice conversion therapy under this bill would be at risk of losing their medical license for doing so. And this bill is brought by Senator Hunt this year. And so that's kind of the last one we really want to uplift that the Women's Fund is in support of for these hearings on Friday.
Great. Thanks, Kelsey. I've been lovingly calling that Friday as Megan Hunt Equality Day. Megan Hunt introduced all of those bills, which is amazing. It'll be a big day in Judiciary. So another priority that is outstanding, that is sort of a late hearing for the Women's Fund, and one that we're really going to be pushing lots of contact on, is LB 20. This is a bill that was introduced by Senator Carol Blood. If you tuned in before or receive our emails, you would know that we've been talking about this one pretty extensively. It would reduce barriers to contraception fundamentally. The bill would ensure that insurance coverage doesn't serve as a barrier to medical providers offering a longer duration of hormonal contraceptives. So for example, pills, the patch, the ring. If your medical provider, if it's their expertise to and their recommendation to provide a prescription to you for your birth control for up to a year, many times health insurance will not cover that long to be provided at a time. So folks are often forced to either return to their provider or return to a pharmacy every month or every 3 months to pick up additional supply. This creates medically unnecessary barriers for women in need and who desire to access contraception. It creates barriers for folks who have unreliable transportation, who may experience challenges and live a long ways from their provider or their pharmacy, for those who may work long hours, unconventional hours. It just creates additional barriers to folks who wish to continue their method of contraception. So we think it's really important to raise this one up and provide some additional information. You see our fact sheets in the chat because it's got a hearing Monday the 1st in front of Banking, Commerce, and Insurance. And we understand that the insurance industry intends to oppose this bill pretty strongly. So we're really want to lift this one up, and we'll be encouraging public comment. The other thing I want to highlight that's next for all of us involved in this process is priority bill deadline. So every senator gets to pick a priority bill, and the deadline is March 11th. And what that means is that it sort of bumps that bill to the top of the line, or enhances it for consideration by the body. The legislature, as we told you last time, they have 684 bills before them. And certainly not all of those get advanced out of committee, but even those that do, there is not enough time to debate all of them. And so they use this priority designation to literally prioritize what they debate and what they get to. So every bill gets a priority, or I'm sorry, every senator gets a priority. The speaker gets 25 priority bills. So senators will ask the speaker to prioritize specific bills. And then each standing committee gets 2 priority bills. And so that is sort of how they filter through the bills that advance out of committee and determine which ones they'll take up. And so any of the bills that we all really care about, we are racing. It's a race to March 11th to find a senator that's interested in prioritizing the bill. It doesn't have to be the introducer, and in fact, many times is not. It is possible that they could both introduce and prioritize, but it is not always the case. And so what happens if you don't get a priority? We have to hope and wait that they get through all the other priority bills, which is really not likely this session. There's going to be limited time for floor debate because of COVID and the adjustments that they've made. The other option is you try to find a vehicle, something else that has a priority that you can amend it onto, but that is not a safe strategy, or it's not without risk and it's not without challenge. So the priority is your best bet. If you don't get a priority this year, but your bill gets out of committee, that still provides an opportunity for them to take it up next year. So because we're in a 2-year cycle, we don't give up on our bills just because they don't get a priority. We continue to push for them and get them ready. So next year we can hit the ground running. How do you get a priority? Well, there's no magic, but the first step is you have to ask, right? So we have to be asking senators, do you have a priority? Would you be willing to prioritize this bill? The other piece that is pretty important to getting a priority is some assurance that they can get it out of committee, right? So many senators won't want to pick a priority bill that they don't have at least some level of assurance that it will advance from committee. Because if you use your one priority and it doesn't get out, you've sort of burned that priority. So this time of year, we're working real hard to get a priority, and we're working real hard to get things out of committee to make them more appealing for a priority choice. So I think we can go to what's needed. Online comments. We are really excited about this new function that the legislature has made available. I think it's something that we've needed for a long time. I find that it makes it much more accessible for folks to, click that button on the bill page, say that they're for it, against it, and then say why. All senators can view it, as we've discussed, right? Every senator can see it, and they can search by their district to see who weighed in. And so we think it's really important that the bills that you care about and the bills that we care about, we are really trying to push public comment through that process, so that when senators take a look, they can see that there's a lot of energy and a lot of support behind certain issues. So if you remember, you go to the bill page, and there's a submit online comment button in the middle of the page, and you can just click on that and then add your information and click send. It's really that easy. I want to lift up that any issue that we've talked about either today or before, if you care about it, submit online comments. Any of the bills Weston talked about, any of the things that Sam mentioned, you know, the APROPES bill in particular for prison, build for the money to build the prison. Any of those bills are important. I'm going to lift up a few that I think are particularly timely now. One is LR20CA. This is a bill that was introduced by, or it's a resolution, that's why an LR, legislative resolution, as opposed to an LB, which is a legislative bill. And the CA is constitutional amendment. So LR20CA is intending to remove language from our Constitution that explicitly states that the only marriage between a man and a woman shall be valid, essentially. It is an effort to reflect marriage equality in our Constitution, as is reflected nationally. So we think it's really important to get a lot of comment in on this one. It isn't a complicated issue. You don't need a PhD, you don't need to write a dissertation, right? It is as simple as I support marriage equality and believe our Constitution should reflect that, you know, period. It really is that simple, but I think we'd like to get a lot of energy around that. So when it does get to the floor, it's very clear that Nebraskans support marriage equality wholeheartedly and want our formal Constitution and laws to reflect that. Additionally, LB20, this is the bill that we just talked about the insurance coverage for birth control, and ensuring that insurance coverage is provided for as long as your healthcare provider prescribes you birth control, right? So if your provider believes a 3-month supply is appropriate and that's what they write the prescription for, great. If your provider is comfortable providing a 12-month prescription, then that is what insurance should cover. Insurance should honor your medical provider's prescription for your birth control. So it would be really helpful for folks to weigh in if you have taken birth control in the past and understand that barrier that exists when your 3-month supply runs out or your 1-month supply, you understand those barriers. Please reach out and say that we should remove unnecessary, unmedically necessary barriers to accessing contraception. And it's really that simple, but we want to get a lot of energy around that bill to help us push back against what will likely be a pretty strong opposition, potentially from the insurance industry. And then LB 451 is, though we've been talking a lot about, Ashley from IB Black Girl was on last week, and the Women's Fund is working with and supporting the leadership of IB Black Girl on this bill. This is it was introduced by Senator Terrell McKinney this year. It's already had a hearing. I believe we had the hearing last week. The weeks are all running together, but the bill remains in committee at this time. And so again, we had set a goal for to get 20 online public comments about this bill. When we got to the hearing, Senator Megan Hunt let us know that there were actually 41 comments in support of this bill, which is awesome. But as Ashley at IB Black Girl tends to do, she took it up a notch and she said her goal is to get 500 online comments. So I was really lowballing it with 40. We are working for 500. So whether you are a person with lived experience and you have been impacted by workplace discrimination because of your natural hair, or if you want to show up as an ally and say that you believe in equal workplaces where people are judged on the contribution to the work and not what they look like, not what their hair looks like. Please show up as an ally. This is the time to stand up for equal workplaces and support Black women in the workplace showing up as who they are. So please submit online comments on 451. We want to keep that rolling. Any questions that I've missed while I've been just talking? Okay, doesn't look like it. So I think with that, we are ready to move to the next slide, if we could. I just want to remind folks of some resources that our incredible public awareness team has put together. We have a Be an Advocate webpage, which has lots of information about the bills that the Women's Fund is prioritizing, and additional fact sheets, etc. They've created a How to Advocate resource, which provides a little bit more information about direct communications with legislators and their staff, and what are components of successful or effective communications. And then of course we could use your support in creating urgency and a sense that these issues are really important by weighing in on social media and utilizing these incredibly cool and beautiful shareables that the Women's Fund team creates. So just wanted to put those links back out there so you remember that those are available for you. And I think with that, we're happy to take any questions. Anything that you came up with for Weston while Kelsey and I talked? Any other questions about other bills? We'll put a few links in the chat, I believe, to sign up for our email updates if you aren't already, to listen to this incredible Power Hour playlist that our team has put together. And as always, we communicate on alternate weeks via email, but the most time-sensitive information we tend to do on social media. So make sure you're following us on Facebook and Twitter, if those are mediums that you're involved in, and if you want the most up-to-date and moment-to-moment resources about what's happening at the legislature, that would be the place to find us. So as always, Kelsey and I are available. We are here to support your advocacy. Our advocacy work at the Women's Fund is only as strong as those voices that we are able to support and elevate. And so if there's anything we can do to help you engage, if you have lived experience and you want to know how to share that in a way that's impactful, please don't hesitate to reach out. That's what we're here for. All right, well, if there are no further questions, I want to give a final thank you to Weston for jumping on and sharing your tremendous expertise and your thoughtful overviews and the consideration that you put into these issues. And it's all thoroughly well-researched. Weston, you just really do an incredible job. And I wanted to thank you for sharing that with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure.
Thanks for the work y'all are doing.
Sure. Well, we'll stick around for a couple minutes, but we'll close it on down.
We're going to jam out to the end.
Let's rock out.
If you're gonna go do it, if you're gonna do it, if you're gonna go do it, just bounce. B-O-L-D, do it. B-O-L-D, do it. People, line up and chase it faster. Who's being told and told it ever matter? What you going? What you going? Look at money in the crack guy. What you going? What you going? And it's only getting better. If you're gonna go do it, if you're gonna do it, if you're gonna go do it, just bounce. B-O-L-D, do it. B-O-L-D, do it. Street girls, they don't know if they're asking. Hey, stay gold, baby, I am a fashion. What you going? What you going? Get the keys to the right back. What you going? What you going? Shaking hands with the right back. Come on, let me see it, see it, see it. Come on, let me see it.